What is AngularJS? Hello everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this MicroNugget, we're going to take a look at one of the coolest new open source web frameworks that's rocking the internet right now, AngularJS by Google. We'll take a real big picture look at AngularJS, talk about all the features and functions that it offers. We'll compare and contrast it to some other web development frameworks out there, and talk about why you and I, as web developers, want to use AngularJS to simplify our front-end web development experience and, frankly, make web development fun again. I've also got some AngularJS code samples spun up so we can take a look at those, get our feet wet right away with building some cool, powerful front-end AngularJS web applications. Let's get started. Over at Angular, they call it the Superheroic JavaScript MVW Framework. You've heard of MVC and you've heard of MVVM, but what's MVW? MVW is whatever works for you. Over at Angular, they're not too concerned with what you call the framework that they're technically using. It could be called a lot of different things. What they're concerned with is making a JavaScript framework that's easy for us as developers to use and simplifies the web development experience for us. And they have a lot of really great principles built into the foundation of Angular to make this possible. Angular is a client-side framework. What this means is that you can pass Angular code down from your web server to your client PC without any changes to your existing web serving technology. It fits right inside your existing technology stack. Angular is also very lightweight and concise. All you need to run an Angular application is a reference to the AngularJS library, which is 100 kilobytes in size. That library itself only extends the existing HTML and JavaScript functionality that you're used to working with on the client side of a web application. Rather than abstracting away into totally new languages, you get to use the languages that you're already familiar with in a way that you're already familiar using them, and it's very easy, very clean, and very straightforward to do. AngularJS is extensible. It's an open source framework. You don't like the way something works in AngularJS, or you want to replace it with something that you've written that you think is better, go right ahead. It's fully extensible, it uses dependency injection to ensure that you can always take over and do what you want to do with the library they've provided. AngularJS is also easily testable. They've gone to great lengths to ensure that AngularJS uses proper separation of concerns and ships with all the end-to-end tools that you need to build unit test harnesses. As developers, with AngularJS, we no longer have an excuse to not properly unit test our code before we roll it out. Some of the features I want to highlight about AngularJS include HTML templating. Like I mentioned before, AngularJS extends the HTML that you already know how to work with. HTML templates ensure that your data is bound inside your HTML documents declaratively and in a way that makes sense and is easy for you as the developer to both implement and understand when you go back to and read it later. Angular uses plain old JavaScript. This is both for the models and the controllers, and this is great because as developers, we don't have to worry about complex JavaScript libraries or objects that need to be inherited into our controllers in order to make them work. Through the miracle of something called dependency injection, we just pass in the dependencies that we need to our controllers as we need them. Angular offers a whole bunch of form validation functions that extend the existing form validation functions that HTML5 already offers. There's a whole host of good reasons to do form validation on the client side, but maybe the biggest of which is localization. A valid date in the United States doesn't look like a valid date in Britain, and it makes sense to have the client PC figure that out, not your server, which could be located really anywhere in the globe. For handling asynchronous communications, Angular implements the Promises API. Promises are a very powerful way to get a hold of an object, a promise, that represents some potentially long-running asynchronous function. That way you can deal with those objects, those promises, either collectively or individually, however you need to within your application. For its HTML templates, Angular uses directives, but it also allows you to create your own custom directives right inside of JavaScript so that you can extend HTML yourself. You can write your own custom functions for HTML so that you can declaratively program inside of your HTML templates. Now Angular does all this and more. These are just a few of the highlights, but let's go ahead and get our feet wet. Let's look at some code and see how this all works. I've got the old classic programming application up here, everyone's favorite programming application, the Hello World application. The way this one works is whatever I type into this little input box gets echoed back down to me in the H1 element right below the input box. And it doesn't matter what I type in, it's updated right on the fly as I key it into that box. Take a look at the code on the left. This HTML document is the entire AngularJS application. There's no additional files, no additional JavaScript to make this application work. There's only a few key elements that I needed to do, a few things that I needed to update my HTML with to turn it into an Angular application. First, I had to reference the Angular.js library. I can't do anything without a reference to the library. Secondly, I use this ng-app directive on this div. Now, ng-app is a directive or an HTML attribute provided by Angular that defines an Angular application within a web page. ng-app creates a root scope for the application to run in, so you can actually have multiple Angular applications running on a single web page, and they all have their own root scope, their own namespace, so you don't have to worry about them conflicting with one another. Now, inside of my app, I've got an input box and an h1 element, and the input box looks just like any other HTML input box with one additional change. It has the ng-model directive on it, and that's set equal to person.name. All this is doing is telling Angular to create a person object, create a name property in that person object, and assign whatever's in the input box to that property. I didn't have to write any additional JavaScript to create that person.name or create that assignment to bind that to the input box. That simple statement right there, ng-model equals person.name, does all the work for me. AngularJS uses something called dirty checking to watch the input box for any changes, and when those changes occur, it updates the person.name variable instantaneously. Below that, in my h1 element, I reference that person.name variable again inside of the double curly braces. The double curly braces are how you define an expression in an Angular app, and that tells Angular to evaluate that expression, to figure out what person.name is, and write that out. Don't just write the actual words person.name on the screen. Super simple, right? It's so easy to read and understand what's going on here that even if you didn't have me explaining it to you, you could probably figure it out. It's incredibly concise, incredibly readable, and Angular goes out of its way to keep everything like that as you go through using it. Let's take a look at a slightly more complex example. In this Angular application, I've got a table with a list of first and last names and the ability for me to add to that list if I'd like. So I can go ahead and key in a name here, click the Add button, and it's dropped right under the table dynamically. Now, the HTML for this is not especially complicated. Still just got an ng-app indicator, this time on my HTML element itself, and I reference the AngularJS library. I also have a reference to a controller.javascript file. We'll take a look at that in a second. That controller.javascript file defines this controller that I've referenced right here, ng-controller equals sample controller. Remember I mentioned that ng-app creates a root scope? Well, ng-controller creates a child scope of that root scope. So now within the confines of this div, we're working with an even subscope that again won't conflict with the broader namespace of our ng-app. The table definition is also very simple. I've got a table row with an ng-repeat directive on it. And that directive says person in people. What that's doing is essentially a for each loop, if you're familiar with for each loops, and that's saying repeat this table row for every object it finds inside of the people array. We'll see the people array when we look at the JavaScript. Finally, I've got my last row that has my two input boxes that are bound to add last and add first, and a button that is bound with ng-click to a function called add person. Let's take a look at the code. Controller.js is where our controller is defined, and this is all the application logic. Notice that the function definition sample controller takes a variable called scope. That's dependency injection in action. Sample controller didn't have to extend or expand any kind of library, any kind of object. It's simply a plain old JavaScript function, and its dependency, in this case it needs the scope variable, is injected by Angular. Now the scope variable is what Angular uses to contain the scope that we talked about earlier. This is the scope of the controller, and that's why the people array is defined right inside of that scope. This means we could have another controller elsewhere on our page that had its own people array that would be totally separate and distinct from this people array. Below that, I've simply defined the add person function on the scope, and all that does is generate a new ID and push that right onto the list, right onto the array. Now back in our index.html, because the array was bound with the ng-repeat directive to the table, the second that person is pushed onto the array, the table updates with the new name that we've pushed onto it. So all I have to do is click add, and there's the new name added onto the bottom of the list. Alright, that was AngularJS in a nutshell, a very high-level overview of what AngularJS is and what it does for us as developers and how it allows us to create these really cool dynamic web applications. We talked about the different properties of AngularJS, how it's a client-side framework, runs in JavaScript, and we also looked at some of the features and functions that it offers to us as web developers. Finished up by looking at some cool code samples so you can see just how quick and easy it is to get up and running with AngularJS. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this informative.